Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this video I'm going to share with you 12 books that I will definitely read next year. I do this every year. I pick 12 books that I definitely will read, and one of the reasons is because I know a lot of you ask, what am I reading, so that you can follow along when I summarise them or sometimes give an in-depth review. So if any of these take your fancy, go out and grab them for next year and then join me in reading them. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? So I thought I would do these in chronological order, starting with the earliest date going forwards. And you'll notice that I've got a particular preference for around the turn of the 19th and 20th century in this video. But starting up is a book from 1836 by Balzac, the French novelist, and this is Old Goriot, or Goriot, I don't know how you say it in French. Now, this book is part of his human comedy series, that some say it's the pivotal book amongst it, where he takes a look at just the run of life in its tragic comedic sense. Old Goriot, he resides at a Parisian boarding house, and everyone around him sort of is respectful to him because he's quite wealthy, but his wealth declines, and as it runs out, people begin to shun him and to snub him, and you have a problem because he has two people who keep visiting him when everyone else has rejected him, and they're two beautiful young women. Now, Goriot says that they're his daughters, but there's a bit of a sinister, criminally minded guy at the boarding house who suspects that this can't be right. And also, there's a young lawyer, I think it is, called Eugenie Rastignac, who actually finds out the truth and thinks he can turn it to his own advantage. So how does that work out for the two women involved? How does it work out for old Goriot himself? And you also get a nice panoply of different characters swarming about in this book. Not caricatures, but there's a sinister level, but comedic as well. So dark comedy in some respects. So that's my first book that I would definitely be reading next year, Old Goriot. So the next book was written in 1848, and you'll not be surprised to know that this is by Charles Dickens. I always promise to read one Dickens at least in a year, and this one is Dombey and Son. Like a lot of his works, it's quite a hefty book. You know, you could replace your doorstep with this. Now, Dombey and Son is based around the man Dombey, who runs a business, and it's the obsession and main focus of his life. Now, it's called Dombey and Son. He's got a son who he wants to inherit the business. He's determined he's going to, despite the fact that the son is a bit kooky and has bad health. Now, Dombey also has a daughter, but the idea of training her up to help with the business or even inherit the business is anathema to Dombey. Girls do not take part in Dombey and Son, is something that he is frequently heard to say. Now, a problem develops. You get this particular scene in a street where his daughter gets into a bit of a pickle and is rescued by another character, Walter Gay. I love the fact that it's called Gay because it's happiness against such a dour backdrop. And you know, with Dickens, his characters' names are very rarely accidental. He thinks about a particular sound, a particular rhythm, or a particular meaning. Like in Oliver Twist, you have the horrid courtroom judge called Fang. You know, that's the kind of names that he gives. So Walter Gay rescues this daughter in the unusual street scene. And his friends then think, hey, if you marry her and you're in favour with the dad, if the son's got ill health, you stand to inherit the whole business. And so it's quite optimistic, but it doesn't work out as people would want it to or as you would expect it to. This book was said to make grown men cry. Now, had that been said in the 18th century, making a grown man cry would have been easy. They used to look at daisies and burst into tears because they used to show their sentiment. But we're talking past the Regency now, realism is beginning to start. There's a criticism of the old way of doing things being over sentimental, and so it's at this point that the British typical reserve that is known today of stiff upper lip, never crying, never showing emotions, is really what's expected in society. So for grown men to cry over this was actually a big deal in Victorian Britain. Also, Thackeray said of Dombey and Son, he just said, how can a writer write in response to the force that Dickens put into this book? So there you go, Dombey and Son, second one that I will definitely be reading next year. I don't know in what particular order, but I will be reading it. So third on the list is a book written in 1860 by none other than George Eliot, and it is Mill on the Floss. Mill on the Floss happens to be one of my wife's favourite books. You have Maggie and Tom Tulliver from Dorlcote Mill in the Midlands, and it's a typical Eliot piece of work, you know, pastoral English country village life. Now, in this book, it focuses on Maggie Tulliver herself and her constant desire for approval from her parents, particularly from her father. But you follow her, it's almost a Bildungsroman, you know, the growth from childhood upwards, but it doesn't take her to any length of years. She's sort of young womanhood when the book, it takes most of the place in that part. And what you get, when her family is running the mill, they come into difficulties because of society, circumstance, and monetary problems. And you see how this affects the family, particularly from Maggie's eyes, and how she tries to keep moving and navigating her way through her growing life and her changing. But it's based fundamentally on the four men and how they have an influence on Maggie. So she wants the approbation of her father. He's quite an austere guy. Then you've got her brother. He is pretty, well, he's not just pretty, he's vengeful. Vengeful is the word. And he's quite stern as well. She also has an old playmate who loves her dearly, and she has a deep affection for him. But there's also the player, the bad boy kind of character, who comes in that turns her head, the charming and charismatic. What's beautiful about that is it's everyone's story. Everyone knows that part of life, all the different figures in their life, and we're talking particularly the male figures here, and how one interacts with them. But also, it's charming from the idyllic setting of Dorlcote Mill. I remember reading this a long time ago, but you know, I don't think I picked that much out of it, which is why I want to go back to it. I read it, I believe, when I was too young, and so I'm excited to go back into this book and really explore Eliot's own thoughts, or should I say Mary Ann Reid. Explore her thoughts and her observations of life and try to engage in her perspectives and any conclusions she comes to and see whether I agree with them. So that was number 3, Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Next up, we jump another 20 years to the year 1880, where we find Dostoevsky's masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov, or the Karamazov Brothers. Again, Wordsworth Classics doing a wonderful job with the artwork. Actually, all the Dostoevskys have these crash test dummies on, and together they look quite good. But on their own, I mean, what kind of cover is that? Okay, the Karamazov Brothers. In this book, one of the reasons I'm excited to read it, I meant to read it last year but didn't, but it wasn't on my 12 to read list. He carries on his ideas that he started with Crime and Punishment. And I have an in-depth review of Crime and Punishment, which I highly recommend, if I don't say so myself. If you've read Crime and Punishment, to go and listen to that and get some of the deeper ideas and motifs that Dostoevsky was exploring. Now, that changed Dostoevsky's own outlook on life, and he continued following the philosophy and the ideas he had come to a conclusion with in The Brothers Karamazov. You have in here the father, right at the beginning, this is no spoiler, he's waiting for an amorous tryst, and he's bumped off. Someone kills him. Now you have the 3 brothers. Dmitri, passionate. You have Ivan, he's the intellectual, very scientific, very philosophic. And then you have Alyosha, who is a monk, and chastity and everything like that. Now, they all have to deal with their father's death. Patricide. Who killed the father? And were any of them, even if they didn't kill him personally, were they implicitly part of it? Or complicit, should I say? And you have this dysfunctional setup between the three. And what's great is you have the three chief perspectives of life, the three chief modes of operation, which is the passion and the artistry, the chastity and the religiosity, spirituality, and the intellectual philosophical approach. Each brother sort of holds one of those ideals higher than the other two. Who makes the strongest case for their way of living? How do they intertwine with each other? Where can they not agree? What struggles do they have in sharing a worldview? This is what Dostoevsky excels at, is worldviews. He knows how to, and this is where classic literature, real great classic literature, has its main pedestal. And that is, it's not just a story, it's using story to populate with people who the author has met or knows the mindsets of or has read the treatises of and makes them live it. So it's no longer a theoretical idea, but actual life. What would happen if you took these ideas to their end result? So, the Brothers Karamazov. Have you read it? By the way, I just want to say here, if you have already read it, go over to the Codex Cantina. Brilliant, brilliant booktubers. And they have done a review of the Brothers Karamazov, which I think you would all love if you've already read it. If not, grab it and read it with me next year. Our next book is one that I spoke about actually in my last video. This was written in 1885 by the German author Theodor Fontane, and it is Effi Briest. I'm looking forward to this book. So roughly the synopsis: Effi Briest gets married to a chap in the political workings of society in Prussia. He's away a lot for weeks on end, and where they've gone to live is a small community that don't really accept Effi into their bosom. And basically what happens, you get a guy who comes who is a sort of a professional philanderer. He's married, but he's a womanizer, and his name is Major Krampus, which makes me laugh because it sounds like he's a man who's been riding his horse too long, doesn't it? And she falls for him. When you've not got affection from anywhere, when your husband's not attentive, you need to find your love somewhere, don't you? But how wrong is adultery? The need for love, the need for passion and desire against the milieu of society and norms, social mores. What's the fallout for Effi Briest? Is it fair? How perplexing and bewildering is it? Now, why I'm interested in this, of course, I mentioned before, Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. He looks at marriage as an institution, boredom, and then adultery and its consequences. What's interesting, though, is France as a Catholic nation. This takes place in Prussia, which is very much a Protestant nation. And that can often make a quite austere sort of reaction to sin on a large scale, as in adultery. So that will be interesting to see how Fontane perceives the role of society in forming the breakup of marriages, or the way a marriage is structured in a way that maybe brings a fault, what's the word? I'm trying to find the words here. The way that marriage is structured, which maybe gives it an inherent flaw in the way it was put together in society back then. This is something that's explored a lot in the world of latter 19th century literature. So something clearly was wrong with the way marriage was set up then, not necessarily marriage itself. So there you go, Theodore Fontane's Effi Briest. We jump ahead another 10 years now to the year 1895. Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure. I like to read Hardy every year as well, at least one of them. That's why this is on the list. Jude the Obscure. If you think Tess of the D'Urbervilles can break your heart, Jude the Obscure, Jude the Obscure can sink you into a chasm of despair. You have the main characters, Jude and Sue in this. Jude Fawley is a stonemason and he wants to better his place in life. And this is part of what the story is about. Hardy is always looking at how society is unfair to people, how people can't achieve what they want in life, and how life then is unfair. It's also full of chance events, the fates as it were, which normally deal people a blow more than giving them anything of benefit. Now Jude has a failed marriage and his wife runs away from him. He wants to better himself, but because of his position in society, his status, and this is at the end of the 19th century, there's rumblings trying to change society here, but he can't move ahead. Also, his financial situation doesn't help him. And then there's Sue, his cousin, who marries someone 20 years older than her. And again, this is a bit of a look at marriage again as an institution in the latter 19th century. The theme of marriage and adultery, although this is not so much about adultery, the theme of marriage, divorce, society's expectations on women, this is very, very much in the literature of the time and informs people's perspective of marriage today, which is an institution which is under quite heavy duress. And that really started around this time of Theodore Fontaine, of Flaubert, of Giercis, of Hardy, of Anna Karenina, Tolstoy. You see, this is all going on at this point, and clearly there was something wrong with the institution of marriage, the way it was assembled in the society of its day. And it's almost like people have lost sight that it's not marriage, it's the way marriage was used that was the problem. So that's going to be interesting to look at this, because Sue, she's not like Jude, who has quite a religious strength, a great faith. Sue is far more the sceptical character, and she's quite shocking in her position on marriage and on sexuality. Although it's not, don't get me wrong, it's never a seedy book. But yes, a very powerful story about how their lives want to go forward, but as is typical with Hardy, how everything seems to slide backwards. So that was the next book that I will definitely read next year, Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. The next book that I've got on my list of definite reads for next year is by the brilliant Brazilian author Machado de Assis, and it was written in 1899. It is Dom Casmurro. Now, this year I did read Epitaph of a Small Winner, absolutely magnificent book, absolutely brilliant. It's like one of the most modern novels I've ever read. And a lot of my Brazilian viewers, Portuguese viewers told me you must read Dom Casmurro, and I will definitely read it this year, hopefully sooner rather than later. In it you have the main character Bento, just had to look to double check, and he recounts a bit like the guy in Epitaph of a Small Winner. The way it's written, very small chapters. I don't know if you can see this. Really small chapters. And that makes it very easy to read and very conversational in its narrative, which is very engaging and very personal, because it's almost like the little thoughts that we get in our mind. And what's interesting, again, adultery comes into play here. So this is a worldwide topic which many a novelist is looking at, the role of marriage, the role of love, the role of desire. In here you have the role of deception, willful or self-deception, to convince oneself of what is permissible. What's great about this when I'm thinking of reading Effi Briest? Brazil. This is a highly Catholic country. Now, if the Protestant version of God can often be a very harsh taskmaster in the sky, dishing out retribution and thunderbolts for wrongdoing, the Catholic take in this time was very much like the bank accountant in the sky, who, not as hard as the Protestant God, but you sort of weigh up. It's a balancing act between wrongs and rights. And I suppose that might, I don't know, but it might lend itself to the self-deceptive nature instead of the austere, hard right and wrong. And there's a question that everyone has at the end of this book. Apparently, I was told by one viewer that if you say to any Brazilian, did she cheat or didn't she, they will know exactly what you mean. They will know it's Dom Casmurro that you're talking about. So that's the next book on my list, Dom Casmurro by Machado G. Assis. Next up is a book that was also written in 1899. I think it was finished in November of 1899, so we're right on the turn of the century. And this is you've noticed that I've got Effi Briest from 1880 up to 1899. I'm interested in that time to focus on. And it's Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. This is the third of Tolstoy's books and not as well known as War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But what an interesting book this promises to be. You have the main character in this, Nekhlyadov, and he is called to be on a jury in an infamous case. I think the case is murder. And he's suddenly startled by the fact that the woman who comes out as the defendant is a woman that he has tried to seduce in the past. In fact, I think he did seduce her in the past. And that seduction led to calamity in her life, sending her down a pathway of prostitution. I don't know how that works, but I would imagine that's because once you've lost your reputation as a woman back then, you're stuck. How do you make your way in life? A lot of your success in life depended on your marrying, and if you were tainted, then you couldn't marry, and the only way to support yourself, prostitution. Well, of course, because of this story, Nekhlyadov feels at heart a responsibility towards this woman. And when she's accused of being guilty, this is not a spoiler, apparently this happens quite early on, Nekhlyadov embarks on trying to get the charge overturned. This is compassion for misdemeanor. This is something you see with Dostoevsky as well, and Tolstoy in Anna Karenina. You see this compassionate side to the wrongdoer, rather than a rigid right and wrong that has no room for mercy or ever forgiving. Even if someone is in the wrong, can you forgive them at a later point? And so off goes Nekhlyadov through the whole labyrinth of bureaucracy and red tape of the courts. This is something Dickens had pointed out in Britain about 50 years before in Bleak House. So this is what Tolstoy works on. He goes through the dark parts of the alleys, he goes to the prisons, and how he's stopped and halted and flustered and stymied at every single turn. And that's the story. So will he manage to get the woman's sentence overturned? Will he manage to get her off from the death penalty? Maybe she still ends up in prison, I don't know, but not to die. How's it all going to work out? Really looking forward to reading this. It's been on my want to read for absolutely ages. So there's the next one, Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Next on the list is a book, again, that I recently spoke of in the last video along with Effi Briest, and it is The Radetzky March by Joseph Roth. I really am looking forward to getting into this. I will tell you now, I will be reading this in February. I will start at the beginning, so if you want to do a read-along, which many of you have said you would like to read this book with me, hopefully, I'll give more details later, but I'll read it in February, and maybe we'll break it into sections, and I'll do a live where maybe we could have a bit of a back and forth about what we get from the book. Now, the Radetzky March is classed as one of the best pieces of work of the 20th century. It follows the Trotter family. That's not the Trotters from Only Fools and Horses, the British sitcom, but an actual baron family, a family of the peerage. It starts with a lieutenant becoming elevated to the baronage because of saving Franz Joseph in the Battle of Salerno, I think it might have been. No, Solferino, I think it is. Anyway, a battle. He saves the emperor, becomes a baron, and he wants to go back to his ordinary life. He doesn't want to be drawn into the aristocracy, but there you go. He gets stuck that way. His son comes along, and the first Trotter does not want his son to enter into the army because certain things about the way history is recorded for the favour of the emperor, for the favour of the monarchy, doesn't sit right with him. It's dishonest. And so his son doesn't go into the army, but we follow his life, and then we follow the next generation of the Trotter family. And this is sort of the demise. And what Roth does through the Trotter family is mirror the Habsburg monarchy, which was at its zenith in about 1850, 1860, And it finishes at the beginning of the First World War, which was when the monarchy was at its nadir. It still thought of itself as a supreme power in Europe. Unknowingly, it had lost all of its power. And of course, where is it today? So this is apparently one of the best books written in the 20th century. So grab yourself one of these before February and join me in a read-along. Our next book jumps ahead to 1954 and is by John Steinbeck. It's what he considered his magnum opus, and that is East of Eden. And I want to give a particular shout out to subscriber Jason High, who has got me to get this book and has been asking me to read it for ages, and I really have wanted to, but now it's got a special place on a book I would definitely read this year. So in this book, it's set in the plains of the Salinas Valley, California, and it runs through a couple of generations from the turn of the 20th century to, I believe it's the end of the First World War, so the first 20 years of the 20th century. And it's two families, the Trasks and the Hamiltons, and how their lives and the characters intertwine. Now with, what's his face, Steinbeck, he often goes from a worldview perspective, often religious worldview, and this one seems to have the Christian worldview at the background, because East of Eden, Adam and Eve, we look at through the Trasks and the Hamiltons, it sort of plays out the Adam and Eve fall from grace, the sin, the original sin of taking the fruit from the tree of the garden, the fruit of the knowledge of good and bad from the centre of the Garden of Eden. But also, after mirroring that through the two families, we follow on to the next massive story or critical story in the Bible, which is Cain and Abel, this murderous relationship, this murderous intent of Cain to murder his brother Abel over jealousy. So this is going to play out, but on a family scale stretched over around 20 years. I don't know any more about this book. All I know is it's thought of as Steinbeck's best, and it's apparently powerfully moving. Now, I read Cannery Row last year, and that was very moving. That looked at the religious philosophy of Taoism, and you can go and see my in-depth book review on that. It's about 40 minutes long, and that was brilliant. I love that book. So I've got high hopes for this one, especially as Jason, who reads a lot of classics himself, recommended it. I trust his opinion. So there you go. Next one, East of Eden by John Steinbeck. The next book on my list is currently in the post, and I'm waiting for it to get here, and it's by Shusaku Endo, the great Japanese 20th century novelist. He wrote this book in 1966, and it's called Silence. I thought I'd start with this one because looking at Endo's work, of which there's a lot, this one most people say is the best to start with. Some say it's actually the best one he wrote. And the story, as far as I know, follows a Jacobin missionary who goes to Japan after a revolution which has put Christianity in a condemned state. It's sort of oppressed, opposed. Religious persecution is sort of the motif inside this. But how this missionary goes because of his devotion to God and to spread the gospel. But there's pandemic there, there's plague. He's oppressed with heavy religious persecution. How does he cope? And part of the book, from what I understand, and maybe I'm wrong, but from what I've sort of looked at briefly, is that inner strength, that inner peace of the quiet God who follows his loyal follower, who watches over them, helps them to keep on enduring to the end, as the phrase would go. Endo is renowned as an author, and I read Shipwrecks this year at the recommendation of Tokyo Chemist, another booktuber who is brilliant, by the way. Shipwrecks was brilliant. I loved it. It's so good to see another culture's writing. You can sympathise with all the feelings from whatever culture, because we're all humans, we all have the fundamental feelings, but it's just the perspective that's taken. And I hope to read a few more Japanese novels and Chinese this year, but that's the one that I would definitely be reading. Silence by Shusako Endo, I believe is how you pronounce it. The last book on my list of 12 books I definitely will read next year is from the Colombian author Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This was written in 1985, so just pushing what I class as a classic, but it's still in print and, you know, it's so widely purchased around the world that if it has that mass appeal to people and that enduring story, it suggests that it will go down as a classic in literature. So you have, in this book, it's set at the Caribbean, and you have the character, he's a hopeless romantic, Florentino, and he falls in love with Femina, who is beautiful and he just adores her, but she marries the influential and famous Dr. Juvenal. And, you know, away she goes. But Florentino, he still loves her. But this is not a case of adultery. He loves her, but he doesn't interfere with the marriage. And yet, 51 years later, 51 years and 9 months, I think it is, Dr. Juvenal dies. And now, Florentino wants to go to Femina and tell her that he loves her still, to express his undying love. Now, how will that go? How does he feel in the meantime? What happens in your life when you really, really do have a love of your life who went off with someone else, married someone else, but you could never remove them from your memory or your heart? How do you deal with that? What effect does that have on you? And can that love still be there at the end on both sides? This is a story discussing unrequited love. Does it actually have a good ending? I don't know. There's a film about this, so if you watched it, you'll know, but I don't. So Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Have you read this one? What did you think? And if you want to do any follow-alongs with me, I can't tell you which months I will be doing these books in, except for one, and that's the Radetzky March. I would do it in February. But if you like the sound of any of these, if you want to follow along on this channel with looking through some books in particular, you want to know what I'm reading, these are 12 I definitely will cover over the coming year. It may not take me even all year, but I would definitely read these 12. So that's the 12 on my list. I want to say that I had other ideas of books that I'd like to read. I would like to read a bit more, like I said, Japanese and Chinese literature, more South American literature this year. I want to look a little bit at the development of the spy genre as well, particularly John le Carré, who's not just thriller, spy, suspense. It's actually, he's very interested in the humanity, the human nature of the spy. And that's what makes classics. It's the exploration of the person. These spies may have exciting stories about them, but there are real people who have been spies in the Cold War. What is it like to be them? What are the pressures? What are the sensations? What are the feelings and desires and worries of these characters? How do they perceive the world that they operate in? I find that very interesting. I'm also interested in maybe looking at a few books around the First World War. Books like Storm of Steel maybe, or All Quiet on the Western Front by Remarque. That's going to be there, of course, and who knows what else. If I can get Vanity Fair in there, I think I'll throw Vanity Fair in. A bit of Trollope I think I would like to cover as well. And I doubt this is possible with everything else that I want to do, but I wouldn't mind looking at Ben-Hur by Lew Wallace from America. Ben-Hur, the masterpiece of ancient Roman novels, with Masala and Ben-Hur himself. But I don't know if you know this, Wallace never even visited the Holy Land. He wrote that book based on looking at the deserts of America and just going to the Library of Congress and researching ancient Rome. He did the whole thing in imagination, which is remarkable, and I'd love to see how that comes out. Whether I actually get round to Ben-Hur, I don't know, but if I don't, I'm pretty sure it'll be on 2023's reading list. Anyway, are there any things you particularly want to read this year? Comment below. Is there any particular culture that you would like to read literature from this year? And are there any of these books that you think, I'm going to get that, and follow along when I say that I'm reading it. Which ones are you going to join me with? Until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.